Well, we come to the last of the gifts of the Spirit listed in 1 Corinthians 12. Now remember that these gifts identified in this list are not meant to provide us with an exhaustive list. We're not meant to assume when we read this that this is every single gift that there might possibly be available for use in the church. We have seen that Paul gives a number of different varying lists at different times. So this is meant to be illustrative. But it is helpful to go through this list and to think about some of the different ways in which we can serve the gospel. And remember that it's not so much that these are gifts given to us that we want to acquire for ourselves, but rather that the gifts are given through us to the church, so that indeed we are the gift to the church. And what we need to be thinking about is not what gift would I like to have, but what gift does my local church need in order to serve Christ in our context at this particular time? Well, the last gift that I want to draw your attention to is sometimes referred to as the gift of tongues. In 1 Corinthians 12, verse 10, towards the end of the verse, the New Living Translation puts it this way, that God gives someone else the ability to discern whether a message is from the Spirit of God or from another spirit. So there is a gift of discernment through the Holy Spirit there. And then still another person is given the ability to speak in unknown languages. That's the gift that you've often heard referred to as the gift of tongues, because the literal word that translates the Greek word glossolalia is tongues. But the point about tongues is that is just a way of saying in everyday language today we would say languages. Fascinating, isn't it, how hearing a word that we've come to associate in a kind of mystical, mysterious kind of way, magical way even, to hear the contemporary, everyday equivalent might even affect our perspective on this. What does it mean to have a gift of tongues, or the gift to speak in other languages? Now, even at this stage, probably the reference to unknown languages may well be an overtranslation. Really, this is the gift of languages. A bit of background. On the day of Pentecost, when the disciples were in Jerusalem, they received the Holy Spirit. Remember that imagery of tongues of fire on their heads as they were baptized with the Holy Spirit. And they go out and they start praising God. And the people round about begin to hear. And they hear in their own language, or their own dialect. Possibly it's their own dialect even, rather than necessarily different languages, although other languages may have been included as well. But some do not hear their own language. To others, it is just a babble, just unintelligible chaos, to the point where they say, these men are drunk. So that Peter has to say, look, the pubs aren't even open, what you want about? But the result of hearing God's praises in their own tongue, in their own language, is that people start to engage, and Peter is able to preach the gospel. the impression that we're given there is that primarily this gift is assigned to get people's attention, and it's an ability to speak so that people will hear and understand in their own language. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul also talks about the gift of languages, and Paul is happy to say, look, I could boast about that. I could say I've got this ability to speak in tongues, to speak other languages more than pretty much anyone. But Paul's concern is this: that within the church, he wants people to be edified. And so his concern is that if people are speaking in other languages and the hearers are not able to understand, because the language used is not their language, and there is nobody there to interpret, then they will just hear something that is unintelligible. And the person who is speaking the language may be encouraged themselves, but no one else is encouraged. And so Paul would rather speak one or two words in a language that is understood than lots of words in a language that isn't understood, because he wants people to be built up and encouraged. And also, if non-Christians come in and they just see people talking away and they can't understand it, then again, the sign is not going to be effective in drawing them to Christ. It's going to turn them away bewildered. Again, for those reasons, Paul would rather prophecy was happening. And that's added to the speculation about what is going on with the gift. Does it mean that if I speak in tongues that I am kind of encouraging and my own heart feelings, that there is something ecstatic and emotional about it that lifts my spirits, that I am managing to pray directly to God? Is it that I am therefore using some kind of heavenly language rather than a human language? Or is it that I myself somehow will know in my heart, will have a level of interpretation to understand what I am saying? And those things have been debated backwards and forwards throughout history. What's my understanding here? Well, my understanding is this: that on the day of Pentecost, people spoke and people were able to understand. There was a gift of human languages. That gift of languages is a sign of what God is doing, reversing the curse of Babel, bringing people from every tribe and tongue together to worship God. It's an amazing sign of the work of the Holy Spirit to apply the gospel so that as we have been reconciled to God vertically, so we are also reconciled horizontally to one another. It's a sign. Now, exactly how that worked at Pentecost and how it works in Paul's experience is a bit difficult for us to get back into that time and observe. And I want to suggest that doesn't matter too much. Back to my point that we have a list that is not meant to be exhaustive. What that enables us to do is to see how God works with our speech and our language and our worship and our prayer to give us as gifts as we are speaking to the church, so that there is a possible range of ways that God can do that. First of all, God can give you the supernatural ability to speak in a language when you've not had that gift before. And that could be a human language or a heavenly language. And it might be that some of you have been helped by speaking in your prayer life a language you do not know, you don't know where it's come from. And the Holy Spirit has used that to encourage you, and there's been that sense of, I've run out of words, but the Holy Spirit has more. And the Holy Spirit is able to speak where I cannot speak. And if that's been your experience, that is great and wonderful. And if that has encouraged you and enabled you to serve and to intercede, then God has used that to bless the church. It may be that one day you will find yourself in a situation and there will be people who can't possibly understand because they don't have your language and you don't have theirs. And somehow God will work to help them understand so that you're able to share the gospel, so that you're able to encourage them, so that you're able to edify them. And you will not know how or why that has happened. And again, if that happens, it's incredible. Rejoice in it. But if we are talking about gifts of language, we also need to recognize that God may work through what seems ordinary means to do supernatural things. I've managed to learn a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Hebrew, and when I was younger, a little bit of French and a little bit of German. I've even occasionally learnt sort of numbers and the odd word in everything from Arabic through Chinese through to sign language. But I can tell you that I have no gifting when it comes to languages. I struggle with those things. I have to work, and it's desperately poor. But I have heard people who have worked hard at learning languages, and they've been given a gift for it, a talent for it, and they are able to speak another language that isn't their own language with incredible fluency and brilliant communications, and they're able to interpret. I've stood next to somebody who has interpreted what I've been saying into Spanish, and it hasn't just been that they've given this wooden translation, but they have shared, and their heart has been involved, and it has been that they have been preaching alongside me. And I want to suggest that there you see a gift of languages and a gift of interpretation at work. I am less concerned with how that gift comes about, whether it happens through a process of time or is instantaneous. I am more concerned with what the Holy Spirit does with it for the church. So I want to encourage you to use the gifts that God has given you. Be prepared to be surprised by the unexpected, but also work hard at growing and improving in those areas that God has given you gifting, with that objective of proclaiming the gospel and loving and serving the church, so that Christ is honoured and his body is built up in love.